December 7th, 1941. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida circled his Nakajima bomber over Pearl Harbor, watching oil-blackened smoke tower thousands of feet into the Hawaiian sky. Through his headset came the reports from his strike leaders. Battleship Row burning, hangars demolished, hundreds of American aircraft destroyed on the ground. The radio crackled with a single phrase, repeated with rising jubilation, "Tora, Tora, Tora." Tiger, tiger, tiger. Complete surprise achieved. What Fuchida couldn't see from his cockpit, what would haunt Japanese planning for the next 6 months, were the empty berths where America's aircraft carriers should have been. Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, all at sea, all untouched, all very much alive. But on that December morning, as Fuchida's formations winged back toward the 6 carriers of the Kido Butai, waiting 200 miles north, such concerns seemed distant. The Imperial Japanese Navy had just accomplished what no Asian power had achieved in modern history. They had struck the heart of Western naval dominance and drawn blood. The 6 months that followed would seem to prove that Pearl Harbor was no fluke. Wake Island fell after a heroic defence. Guam surrendered within hours. The British fortress of Singapore, supposedly impregnable, capitulated with 80,000 troops behind its walls. The Philippines were collapsing despite desperate resistance. The Dutch East Indies vanished in weeks. Ceylon was raided. Darwin was bombed. From the Aleutians to New Guinea, from Burma to the Central Pacific, the rising sun flag flew over an empire won in 180 days. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studied maps of the Pacific with growing unease. He knew what the victory reports couldn't change. America's industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm Japan unless the war ended quickly. The carriers that had escaped at Pearl Harbor remained a threat that grew with each passing week. He needed a decisive battle. He needed to force America's hand before those shipyards building in California, Virginia, and Massachusetts could flood the Pacific with new carriers. Time, Yamamoto understood with perfect clarity, was the one resource Japan could never produce enough of. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya climbed out of his Zero fighter on Akagi's flight deck, pulled off his leather helmet and let the wind cool the sweat in his hair. Another training sortie complete, another perfect landing. Around him, the controlled chaos of carrier operations continued without pause. Flight deck crews in coloured jerseys swarmed over aircraft. Mechanics made adjustments with the precision of watchmakers. Below decks, ordnance handlers loaded bombs and torpedoes with practiced efficiency. This was the Kido Butai at the height of its power. 6 fleet carriers operating as a single weapon. Akagi, the flagship, converted from a battlecruiser hull and modernised with a full-length flight deck. Kaga, another conversion, massive and powerful. The sister ships Soryu and Hiryu, built as carriers from the keel up, fast and deadly. Shokaku and Zuikaku, the newest and most advanced carriers in the world. Itaya had over 800 flight hours in his logbook. He had flown combat missions over China since 1937. He could navigate by dead reckoning across 500 miles of featureless ocean and find his carrier. He could thread his Zero through anti-aircraft fire that would have killed less experienced pilots. He represented the cutting edge of naval aviation, and he knew it. In the ready rooms below deck, pilots studied recognition silhouettes of American ships. They practiced navigation problems. They discussed tactics over cups of green tea. Many had scored victories already. Some were aces several times over. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of professionals who had never lost. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, walked among them with an air of benevolent authority. He could read American publications captured in the Philippines, could understand what American commanders were thinking. He believed the Kido Butai was invincible when properly employed. 6 months of unbroken victory had done nothing to shake that belief. What none of them could see, what the endless training sorties and successful operations obscured, was that they were burning through irreplaceable resources with each mission. Experienced pilots lost in combat couldn't be quickly replaced. The training pipeline back in Japan produced perhaps 100 fully qualified carrier pilots per year. Mechanics and technicians required years of experience. The Kido Butai's greatest strength, its expertise, was also its most vulnerable asset. But in the spring of 1942, such concerns seemed theoretical. They were winning. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on Akagi's flag bridge as his carriers withdrew from Hawaiian waters on December 7th. Staff officers congratulated him on the successful strike. 8 American battleships sunk or severely damaged. Over 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet crippled. Yet Nagumo felt no triumph. Commander Minoru Genda, his air operations officer, had urged a third strike wave to destroy Pearl Harbor's repair facilities and fuel storage tanks. Nagumo had refused. His carriers had struck twice. American defences were alerted. Fuel was running low. Most critically, he had no idea where America's carriers were. That decision would echo through the next 6 months. Within weeks, American salvage crews would raise several of the sunken battleships. The repair facilities would restore damaged vessels. The fuel tanks, left untouched, would supply the American fleet for years. But the carriers, those had been at sea all along. On April 18, 1942, Nagumo learned the cost of that caution. Lieutenant Hajime Miyazawa, flying combat air patrol over Tokyo, looked up in disbelief as twin-engine bombers roared over the capital at rooftop level. American bombers. Over Tokyo. Over the sacred home islands that were supposed to be inviolate. The Doolittle raid did minimal physical damage. 16 B-25 bombers off the carrier Hornet, each dropping a few bombs before disappearing toward China. But the psychological impact cut deep. Japanese citizens who had been told they were winning the war now watched their homes burn. The military, which had promised absolute defence, had failed to stop even a handful of raiders. For Yamamoto, the raid confirmed his worst fears. American carriers could strike anywhere. Until they were destroyed, Japan's conquests would never be secure. He began planning Operation MI. The target would be Midway, a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Not because Midway itself mattered, but because America would have to defend it. And when they did, he would destroy their carriers in a decisive battle that would end the war on Japanese terms. The plan was complex, almost fragile in its intricacy, but Yamamoto believed in the superiority of Japanese training and leadership. He had no way of knowing that American cryptanalysts were already reading his communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort sat in the basement of the Pearl Harbor Administration Building, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese radio messages. His team at Station HYPO worked in shifts around the clock, breaking codes, analysing patterns, piecing together enemy intentions from fragments of decoded text. By late May 1942, they understood the broad outline. The Japanese were planning a major operation. The target appeared in messages as AF. Rochefort was convinced AF meant Midway. Others argued for the Aleutians, or even a second strike at Hawaii. Rochefort needed proof. The solution came from Midway itself. At Rochefort's suggestion, the base sent an uncoded radio message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Within 48 hours, Japanese communications intercepted and partially decoded referenced AF having water supply problems. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding from Pearl Harbor, now held information that could change the war. He knew where the Japanese would strike. He knew approximately when. He could position his carriers for an ambush instead of rushing them blindly to defend an atoll under attack. But the odds remained daunting. Nimitz had 3 carriers. Enterprise and Hornet were already at sea under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser admiral who had never commanded carriers in combat. Yorktown, badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier, was in dry dock with damage that would normally require 3 months to repair. Nimitz walked through the dry dock, looking up at the gaping holes in Yorktown's hull. He found the yard superintendent and asked a simple question: how long to make her seaworthy enough to fight? The superintendent hesitated. By every regulation and standard practice, the answer was months. But he understood what Nimitz was really asking: how long to patch her well enough to survive one more battle. 72 hours later, Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor with repair crews, still working below decks. Her air group was a patchwork of squadrons. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, knew his ship wasn't fully battle-ready, but she would have to be enough. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton stood before Admiral Nimitz in Pacific Fleet headquarters, briefing from Rochefort's intelligence. He pointed to a position on the chart, 200 miles northwest of Midway. "They'll be here at dawn on June 4th. Nimitz looked at the chart. "How certain are you?" Layton met his eyes. "I'd stake my career on it." The intelligence was good enough to bet the Pacific Fleet on, but it couldn't reveal everything. Rochefort's team could read perhaps 15% of Japanese communications. They knew the general outline of Operation MI, but critical details remained murky. They knew Nagumo's carrier force would strike Midway. They knew approximately where the carriers would approach from, but they couldn't read every tactical decision, couldn't anticipate every movement. What they did know was enough. While Japanese submarines took up positions to ambush American carriers sortying from Pearl Harbor, those carriers were already at sea, moving into position northeast of Midway. While Yamamoto positioned his massive battleship force 300 miles behind the carriers, believing his presence was secret, American commanders knew exactly where he was. The trap was set. But intelligence could only position the pieces. The battle would be won or lost by pilots and sailors, by split-second decisions in combat, by courage and luck in measures impossible to predict. Ensign George Gay, 24 years old, sat in his TBD Devastator on Hornet's hangar deck, writing a letter home to Texas. Around him, other pilots from Torpedo Squadron 8 prepared for what they all knew would be a maximum effort mission. Their squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had briefed them bluntly. They would attack Japanese carriers. Most would probably die, but they would do their duty. Gay sealed the letter and handed it to a friend with instructions to mail it if he didn't come back. Then he climbed into his aircraft and waited for the launch order. Waited June 4th, 1942. 4:30 a.m. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the 108 aircraft off the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu into the pre-dawn darkness. His target was Midway, 240 miles to the southeast. His orders were to neutralize the base's defenses in preparation for an amphibious landing. Tomonaga's formation included 36 Kate torpedo bombers carrying 800-kilogram bombs, 36 Val dive bombers with 250-kilogram bombs, and 36 Zero fighters for escort. They climbed into formation and turned toward Midway, navigation lights winking in the darkness. Behind them, on the carrier decks, ordnance crews prepared a second strike wave. 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. These were the reserve, held back in case American carriers appeared. At 6:16 a.m., Tomonaga's strike reached Midway. Marine fighters rose to intercept. Obsolete F-2A Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats flown by pilots who had never seen combat. The Zeros tore through them with brutal efficiency. 20 of 26 Marine fighters were shot down. Below, Tomonaga's bombers worked over the base methodically. Fuel tanks erupted. Hangars collapsed. The powerhouse took a direct hit. But Midway's anti-aircraft fire was intense, and the base's facilities were dispersed. Tomonaga radioed back at 7 a.m. A second strike would be necessary. Admiral Nagumo, on Akagi's flag bridge, received the message. He looked at the plot showing his reserve strike force armed for ship attack. If American carriers appeared, he would need those aircraft ready immediately. But Midway still posed a threat. He made his decision. Rearm the reserve strike force with land attack weapons for a second Midway strike. Below decks, ordnance crews began the complex process of changing out torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for fragmentation and general-purpose bombs. Experienced crews could complete the process in 90 minutes. They worked with practiced efficiency, unaware that the most critical 90 minutes of the Pacific War had just begun. At 7:28 a.m., a lookout on the cruiser Tone spotted aircraft to the northeast. Minutes later, a scout plane radioed back. Sight, what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 0-10 degrees, distance 240 miles. Nagumo's hand froze over the plot. American ships. But were carriers among them? The scout plane's next message came agonizingly slowly. No carriers sighted. Then, at 8:20 a.m., an update that changed everything. Enemy appears to have one carrier. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gathered Torpedo Squadron 8 in Hornet's ready room at 7 a.m. 15 TBD Devastators, 30 men. He looked at faces he'd trained for months, young men from farms and cities across America who had never seen combat. "We're attacking their carriers," he said quietly. "The Japanese have been at this since 1937. They're experienced. They're good. But we're going to go in and get a hit. Whatever happens to us, we're going to get hit." Nobody spoke. Everyone understood what attacking a carrier meant in a Devastator. The aircraft was obsolete, with a maximum speed of 115 miles per hour. It had to fly straight and level to deliver its torpedo, making it helpless against fighters. It had one forward-firing 30 caliber machine gun and one rear-facing 30 caliber gun operated by the radio man. Against Zeros and anti-aircraft fire from screening ships, that was essentially unarmed. At 9:20 a.m, Waldron spotted the Japanese carriers, 4 flat tops in a box formation, screening ships surrounding them, and above, swarming like angry wasps, at least 50 Zero fighters. "Attack immediately," Waldron transmitted. The Devastators dropped to wave top level and began their run. Zeros fell on them instantly. Ensign Gay, flying in the last section, watched as the aircraft ahead of him started burning. Waldron's plane took hits and went down first. One by one, the TBDs were shot down or set ablaze by anti-aircraft fire. Gay pressed his attack. His radio man, Bob Huntington, fired the rear gun until a 20mm round killed him. Gay's aircraft was hit repeatedly. His controls were shot away. He released his torpedo uselessly and crashed into the ocean. As he surfaced, he watched the last of his squadron mates die. 15 aircraft, 29 men, 0 hits on the enemy. He pulled his seat cushion over himself as camouflage and floated among the debris, watching the battle unfold around him. He would be the only survivor. Torpedo 6 from Enterprise appeared at 9:40 a.m, 14 TBDs. The same story repeated. Zeros slaughtered them, 10 shot down, no hits. Torpedo 3 from Yorktown arrived at 10 CUAS AM, 12 TBDs, 10 destroyed, no hits. In less than 40 minutes, 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers had been annihilated, but they had accomplished something crucial. They had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave top level, chasing the slow torpedo bombers, burning ammunition and fuel. The Zeros were out of position when the dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky's fuel gauge was dropping into the red. He led 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, searching for the Japanese carriers at the coordinates intelligence had predicted. But the ocean below was empty. The carriers weren't where they should have been. McClusky faced the decision every strike leader dreaded. Turn back now with enough fuel to reach the carrier, or continue searching and risk running out of fuel over open ocean. He checked his watch. 9:50 a.m. He would search for 10 more minutes. At 10 a.m, he spotted a lone destroyer making high speed through the water below, trailing a distinct wake. It was racing northeast. McClusky made a calculated guess. The destroyer was rejoining the carrier formation. He followed. 5 minutes later, he found them. 4 Japanese carriers spread across the ocean, their escorts forming protective rings around them. On their decks, he could see aircraft being positioned for launch. Fuel hoses snaked across the wooden decks. Bombs and torpedoes sat exposed, ready for loading. McClusky didn't hesitate. Attack! He rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet. The world tilted vertical. The carrier grew larger in his bomb sight. Airspeed built toward 250 miles per hour. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire filled the air around him. At 1,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of the dive, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat. Behind him, the dive bombers of Scouting 6 and Bombing 6 followed him down. Both squadrons dove on the same carrier initially, Kaga. Then, Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing 6, saw the error. He pulled out of his dive with just 2 wingmen following and swung toward the second carrier, Akagi. Simultaneously, 17 SBDs from Yorktown's Bombing 3 attacked from a different direction, diving on Soryu. The attacks were nearly simultaneous, 3 Japanese carriers hit within minutes of each other. On Kaga, at least 4 1,000-pound bombs struck in rapid succession. One hit near the forward elevator, detonating among fueled and armed aircraft on the flight deck. The explosion touched off a chain reaction. Bombs on the aircraft detonated, torpedoes exploded. Aviation gasoline ignited in sheets of flame. A second bomb penetrated to the hangar deck where more armed aircraft waited. Within seconds, the hangar had become an inferno. Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his bridge crew were killed instantly by a bomb that struck near the command tower. On Akagi, Best's single bomb hit near the amidship elevator. It blasted through to the hangar deck packed with armed aircraft ready for launch. The secondary explosions were immediate and catastrophic. Torpedoes exploded, fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread through the hangar bay faster than damage control teams could react. A near miss by one of Best's wingmen jammed Akagi's rudder, leaving the flagship circling helplessly to port. On Soryu, 3 bombs struck in. Bombs struck. Less than a minute. The explosions detonated among fueled aircraft. Secondary blasts from stored torpedoes tore through the forward section. Within minutes, the entire bow was engulfed in flames. The time was 10:27 a.m. In 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been transformed from instruments of naval dominance into floating funeral pyres. Commander Fuchida was in Akagi's sick bay, recovering from appendicitis surgery when the first bomb hit. The explosion threw him from his bed. He struggled to his feet, felt the ship shudder from secondary explosions, heard the roar of fire somewhere below. He climbed to the flight deck in his hospital gown. What he found defied comprehension. The wooden flight deck was buckled and burning. Aircraft were scattered like broken toys, some burning, some blown over the side. Smoke poured from elevator shafts. Men staggered past him, burned and bleeding. The sound of explosions continued as magazines cooked off below. Admiral Nagumo stood on the flag bridge, watching his flagship die around him. Staff officers urged him to transfer his flag. At 10:46 a.m., with flames approaching the bridge, he finally agreed. A cutter came alongside and took him to the cruiser Nagara. Captain Taijiro Aoki remained aboard, trying to save his ship. Damage control teams fought fires that regenerated faster than they could suppress them. The Emperor's portrait was removed and transferred to a destroyer, the traditional signal that a ship was doomed. Still, Aoki refused to give the order to abandon ship. Below decks, young sailors trapped in engineering spaces died from heat and smoke. Some tried to reach topside and were caught in explosions. Others stayed at their posts until the end, maintaining steam pressure and electrical power for as long as possible. On Kaga, the fires spread even faster. The hit near the bridge had killed most of the senior officers instantly. With no coordinated damage control, fires raged unchecked through the hangar deck. Ammunition exploded continuously. By noon, the flight deck was beginning to collapse into the hangar below. At 4:00 p.m., with the ship clearly lost, the surviving crew abandoned ship. 800 men went into the water. Destroyers rescued what survivors they could find. Soryu fought for her life for 8 hours. Her crew managed to contain some fires and maintain partial power, but the structural damage was too severe. At 7:13 p.m, the order finally came to abandon ship. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto chose to go down with his ship, last seen on the bridge as Soryu rolled over. At 7:20 p.m, a massive explosion tore through her hull as magazines detonated. She sank minutes later. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separated from the main formation and escaped the initial attack. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu, launched 2 strikes that found and severely damaged Yorktown. Bomb and torpedo hits left the American carrier dead in the water, listing and burning, but American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu at 5:00 p.m. Ensign Gay, still floating in his May West, watched from the water as 24 SBDs dove on the last Japanese carrier. 4 bombs hit. The explosions and secondary detonations mirrored what had happened to her sisters. Hiryu became the same kind of blazing wreck. Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku remained on the bridge as fires consumed their ship. Early on June 5th, they gave the order to abandon ship. As the last sailors went over the side, Yamaguchi and Kaku stood on the bridge in full dress uniform. They had tied themselves to the compass pedestal. They would ride Hiryu down. At 9 a.m. on June 5th, Hiryu sank, taking her admiral and captain with her. Ensign Gay was picked up by a PBY Catalina on June 5th after 30 hours in the water. He was severely sunburned and dehydrated, but alive. He was the only pilot from the morning torpedo attacks to survive and witness the entire battle. The statistics told a brutal story. The United States had lost Yorktown, sunk on June 7th by the Japanese submarine Zai-168. The destroyer Hammond broke in two from the same torpedo attack, her depth charges exploding and killing 80 men. American casualties totaled 307 dead and approximately 145 aircraft destroyed. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. The heavy cruiser Makuma was sunk on June 6th during pursuit operations. Japanese casualties reached approximately 3,000 men. Aircraft losses totaled between 248 and 292 planes, depending on how losses were counted. But the numbers couldn't capture the true cost. Among the Japanese dead were 110 carrier-qualified aircrew. Approximately 25% of the pilots and aircrews embarked on the 4 carriers. More critically, over 700 aircraft mechanics, armourers and flight deck specialists went down with the carriers. These men represented years of accumulated expertise that couldn't be replaced quickly. Lieutenant Minoru Genda, recovering from illness in sick bay, when the attack came, survived. He would later write that Midway destroyed more than ships. It destroyed Japan's psychological advantage. We had been confident of invincibility. After Midway, we fought knowing we could lose. For America, Midway validated everything they had gambled on. Admiral Spruance, the cruiser admiral who had never commanded carriers, had made the right decisions at the right moments. Enterprise and Hornet's air groups had fought with a courage that transcended their lack of experience. Within months, American shipyards would begin delivering new carriers. By 1943, Essex-class fleet carriers and Independence-class light carriers would flood the Pacific. Japan would complete far fewer carriers, and those that did enter service lacked adequate numbers of trained aircrew to operate effectively. The Guadalcanal campaign would begin in August, grinding away at Japan's remaining carrier pilots. The war would become exactly what Yamamoto had feared, a contest of industrial production that Japan could never win. In 1985, at a reunion of Midway veterans in San Diego, surviving pilots from both sides met in peace. George Gay, then 69 years old, shook hands with Yuji Akamatsu, a Zero pilot who had attacked his squadron that morning 43 years earlier. "Did you see us?" Gay asked. "Did you see what we did?" Akamatsu nodded slowly. "We saw. You came in so low, so slow. We thought it would be easy, but you kept coming. You died, but you kept coming. That changed everything." The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years. Hundreds of thousands more would die. But the outcome was decided in 5 minutes on June 4th, 1942, when American dive bombers caught 4 Japanese carriers, with their decks loaded with bombs, torpedoes, and aviation gasoline. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor burned and sank, taking with them Japan's strategic initiative and any realistic hope of victory in the Pacific.